Marcus Thompson adjusted his prosthetic leg as he sat in the passenger seat of the rideshare car, watching the rain streak down the window. The job interview had gone better than expected, and for the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope. The company seemed genuinely interested in his skills as a software engineer, and they had been impressed by his military background and the certifications he had earned during his recovery. The driver, a middle-aged man named Pete, glanced in the rearview mirror and struck up a conversation. Marcus had learned to be cautious about sharing his story, but Pete seemed friendly enough. When Pete asked about the slight limp Marcus had when getting into the car, Marcus briefly explained that he was a veteran who had been injured in Afghanistan. "Thank you for your service," Pete said, and Marcus could hear the sincerity in his voice. "My nephew just got back from overseas, too. It's tough out there." Marcus nodded, appreciating the genuine response rather than the awkward pity he sometimes encountered. He told Pete about the interview, how he was trying to get back into the civilian workforce after spending 2 years in recovery and rehabilitation. The improvised explosive device that had taken his left leg below the knee had also shattered his confidence, but slowly, piece by piece, he was rebuilding his life. As they drove through the downtown area, Pete mentioned that he had been driving for rideshare companies for 3 years, ever since he had lost his job at a manufacturing plant. "It's not bad work," he said, "but you meet all kinds of people. Some good, some not so much." Marcus understood. He had encountered a share of both since returning home. Some people went out of their way to help veterans, while others seemed uncomfortable around anyone who reminded them that wars were still being fought. He had learned to navigate these interactions, though it wasn't always easy. The rain was getting heavier as they approached Marcus's neighborhood. It was a modest area, not the best part of town, but it was what he could afford on his disability benefits while he searched for work. His apartment was in a converted house that had been divided into several small units. The landlord was understanding about his situation, which was more than he could say for some of the other places he had looked at. Pete pulled up to the address and turned around with a smile. "Good luck with the job," he said. "I hope you get it." Marcus thanked him and got out, grabbing his cane from where he had propped it against the door. The prosthetic worked well, but the cane gave him extra stability and confidence, especially on wet pavement. As he made his way to his front door, he reflected on how much his life had changed in the past 3 years. Before the explosion, he had been Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a communications specialist with a spotless record and plans to make the military his career. He had been good at his job, responsible for maintaining and troubleshooting the complex radio and computer systems that kept his unit connected with headquarters. The work was technical and demanding, but he had thrived on the challenge. The day everything changed had started like any other patrol. Their convoy was returning to base after a routine mission when the lead vehicle hit the IED. Marcus was in the second truck, and the blast wave had thrown their vehicle off the road. His last clear memory before waking up in the field hospital was the sound of his sergeant yelling for a medic. The months that followed were a blur of surgeries, physical therapy, and slowly coming to terms with his new reality. The doctors and therapists at the VA hospital were professionals, but it was the other veterans in the ward who really helped him understand that life could continue just differently than he had planned. Now, as he unlocked his door and stepped into his small apartment, Marcus allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic about the interview. The hiring manager had seemed impressed by his technical skills and had asked detailed questions about his experience with network security, something he had become passionate about during his recovery. He had used his time in rehabilitation to earn several industry certifications, determined not to let his injury define his future. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Sarah, asking how the interview went. She had been his strongest supporter throughout his recovery, driving 3 hours each way to visit him in the hospital and helping him apartment hunt when he was ready to live independently again. He typed back that it had gone well and that he would know something within a week. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows. Marcus made himself a cup of coffee and sat down at his computer to send a thank you email to the interviewing team. It was a small gesture, but his transition counselor had emphasized the importance of following up professionally after interviews. As he typed, he found himself thinking about the conversation with Pete. It had been refreshing to talk to someone who seemed genuinely interested in his story without either treating him like a hero or a victim. Most people meant well, but they often didn't know how to react when they learned about his injury. Some became overly solicitous, while others seemed to assume that he was completely helpless. The truth was somewhere in between. Yes, there were things that were more difficult now, and he had to plan his days differently than before. But he was still the same person who had excelled at complex technical problems in the military. His mind was sharp, his work ethic was strong, and he had learned to adapt to challenges in ways that many people never had to. He finished the email and sent it, then spent some time reviewing job postings online. This interview had been promising, but he knew better than to put all his hopes on one opportunity. The job search for veterans could be challenging, especially for those with visible disabilities. Some employers were enthusiastic about hiring veterans, while others seemed worried about accommodation costs or assumptions about PTSD. Marcus had been fortunate that his injury was primarily physical. While he still had occasional nightmares about the explosion, he had not developed the severe psychological trauma that some of his fellow veterans struggled with. He had deep respect for those who battled invisible wounds, knowing that their fights were often harder than his own. The rain continued to fall as evening approached. Marcus heated up a simple dinner and settled in to watch the news. The lead story was about a controversial policy change at the local VA hospital. Budget cuts were forcing them to reduce services, and veterans were protesting outside the building. The reporter interviewed several veterans who described long wait times for appointments and difficulty getting the care they needed. Marcus frowned as he watched. He had been lucky with his care at the VA, but he knew that many veterans faced significant challenges navigating the system. The bureaucracy could be overwhelming, especially for someone dealing with serious injuries or mental health issues. He made a mental note to call his friend Jake, another veteran he had met in rehabilitation, to make sure he was staying on top of his appointments. As the news moved on to other stories, Marcus's phone rang. It was his mother, calling from the small town where he had grown up. She had been worried about him since he moved to the city, concerned that he was isolating himself too much. He assured her that he was doing well and told her about the interview. "I'm proud of you, honey," she said, and he could hear the emotion in her voice. "Your father will be proud too." His father, also a veteran, had passed away 2 years before Marcus's deployment. He had served in Vietnam and rarely talked about his experiences, but he had instilled in Marcus a sense of duty and service that had drawn him to the military. Marcus sometimes wondered what advice his father would have given him about transitioning back to civilian life. After hanging up with his mother, Marcus spent some time reading. He had always been an avid reader, and during his recovery, he had discovered a love for biographies of people who had overcome significant challenges. Their stories reminded him that setbacks, even serious ones, didn't have to be permanent. The evening passed quietly, and as he prepared for bed, Marcus felt a sense of cautious hope about the future. The interview had gone well, he was healthy and strong, and he had skills that employers needed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he could rest knowing that he was moving forward one step at a time. He checked his email one more time before turning off the computer. No response yet from the company, but that was expected. As he turned off the lights and settled into bed, Marcus reflected on how far he had come from those dark early days in the hospital when everything had seemed impossible. The rain had stopped, and through his window, he could see the city lights twinkling in the distance. Somewhere out there were opportunities waiting, and he was ready to meet them head-on, prosthetic leg and all. 3 days after the interview, Marcus received the call he had been hoping for. The hiring manager, Jennifer Walsh, sounded excited as she offered him the position. The salary was fair, the benefits were good, and they were willing to make any reasonable accommodations he might need. Marcus accepted on the spot, feeling a surge of relief and pride that nearly brought tears to his eyes. The following Monday, Marcus put on his best suit and took a rideshare to his new office building downtown. The driver this time was a young woman named Lisa who chatted cheerfully about the weather while navigating the morning traffic. Marcus found himself looking forward to establishing a routine again, having a place to go each day and meaningful work to do. The first few weeks at Tech Solutions went smoothly. His coworkers were welcoming, his supervisor was supportive, and the work was challenging in exactly the way Marcus enjoyed. He was part of a team responsible for maintaining the cybersecurity infrastructure for several large clients, and his military experience with secure communications proved invaluable. Marcus settled into a routine. He would take a rideshare to work each morning, usually arriving early to avoid the worst of rush hour traffic. His prosthetic performed well throughout the workday, though he appreciated that his desk setup allowed him to adjust his position as needed. The company had been true to their word about accommodations, providing him with an ergonomic chair and a sit-stand desk without making a big deal about it. After work, he would often stop at a coffee shop near the office to decompress before heading home. It was during one of these evening coffee stops that he first encountered David Chun, a veteran from the Iraq War who was struggling with homelessness. David approached Marcus outside the coffee shop, recognizing something in his bearing that identified him as former military. "Excuse me, brother," David said quietly. "I don't mean to bother you, but I'm in a tough spot. I'm a vet, and I'm trying to get back on my feet." Marcus studied the man's face, seeing the telltale signs of someone who had been living rough. David's clothes were clean, but worn, and there was a wariness in his eyes that Marcus recognized from his own early days of recovery. Instead of just giving him money, Marcus invited him into the coffee shop to talk. Over the next hour, David's story emerged. He had served 2 tours in Iraq as an infantry soldier before being discharged with PTSD and a traumatic brain injury from a roadside bomb. The transition to civilian life had been rocky, complicated by problems with alcohol and difficulty maintaining steady employment. He had been homeless for 6 months, staying in shelters when he could get a bed and sleeping rough when he couldn't. "The worst part isn't the sleeping outside," David explained, stirring his coffee with shaking hands. "It's how people look at you, like you're not even human anymore. I used to be somebody, you know? I had a purpose." Marcus understood that feeling more than he cared to admit. Even with his successful transition back to work, he sometimes felt the weight of other people's assumptions about disabled veterans. He gave David his phone number and information about some resources that might help, including a veterans service organization that had assisted him during his own recovery. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself thinking often about David and the thousands of other veterans who were struggling with similar challenges. His own problems seemed manageable in comparison, but that only intensified his desire to help others who hadn't been as fortunate. One evening, as Marcus was leaving work, he called for his usual rideshare. The app indicated that his driver would arrive in 5 minutes, and Marcus settled in to wait outside the office building. The autumn air was crisp, and he could see his breath as he checked his phone for messages. When the car arrived, Marcus was surprised to see that it was Pete, the same driver who had taken him home after his job interview several weeks earlier. Pete rolled down the window with a grin. "Hey, it's the veteran with the interview. How did that work out for you?" Marcus smiled as he got into the car. "I got the job, actually. This is my 4th week." "That's fantastic. I was hoping things would work out for you." As they drove through the evening traffic, Pete asked how Marcus was settling in at work. Marcus found himself opening up about his positive experience with his new employer, but also sharing his concern about other veterans who were facing greater challenges. He mentioned meeting David and how it had reminded him of the wide spectrum of struggles that veterans faced. Pete listened thoughtfully as Marcus talked. "You know," Pete said, "I drive a lot of different people, and I've picked up quite a few veterans over the years. Some are doing well, like you, but others—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I picked up a guy last month who was clearly having a rough time. He was trying to get to a job interview, but his clothes were all wrinkled, and he seemed really anxious. I felt bad for him." The conversation continued as they made their way across the city. Pete shared that he had a brother who had served in the Navy, and while he had transitioned successfully to civilian life, Pete had seen firsthand how difficult the adjustment could be. He had developed a soft spot for veteran passengers, and often went out of his way to help when he could. "The thing that gets me," Pete said, "is how some people treat veterans. I've had passengers make comments when they see someone who's obviously struggling, like they think every veteran should just snap back to normal life immediately." Marcus nodded, having witnessed similar attitudes himself. People don't always understand that military service changes you, even when everything goes right. And when you add injuries, trauma, or other complications, the transition becomes much more complex. As they approached Marcus's neighborhood, Pete mentioned that he had been thinking about ways to help veterans in his community. He had considered volunteering with local organizations, but wasn't sure where to start. Marcus suggested a few organizations that he was familiar with and offered to connect Pete with some contacts. When they reached Marcus's apartment building, Pete refused to accept payment for the ride. "Consider it a thank you for your service," he said, "and let me know if you ever need a ride to any of those veteran events. I'd be happy to help out." Marcus thanked Pete and got his contact information before heading inside. The encounter had reminded him of the importance of civilian allies in supporting veterans. People like Pete, who took the time to understand and wanted to help, made a real difference in individual lives. That weekend, Marcus decided to visit David at the shelter where he was staying. He found David looking better than before, cleaner and more alert. David explained that he had connected with a caseworker at the veterans organization that Marcus had recommended, and they were helping him apply for disability benefits and look for stable housing. "I want to thank you," David said, "not just for the information, but for treating me like a person. You have no idea how much that meant." Marcus was moved by David's words, but he also felt a growing sense of responsibility. His own successful transition had been aided by good support systems, decent health care, and perhaps a measure of luck. He began to think about ways he could do more to help other veterans who were facing greater challenges. At work on Monday, Marcus mentioned his volunteer interest to his supervisor, Jennifer. She was immediately supportive and mentioned that Tech Solutions had a corporate social responsibility program that included support for veteran causes. She suggested that Marcus might be able to organize some kind of company volunteer initiative. "We have several veterans on staff," Jennifer said, "and I think there would be interest in supporting your efforts. Why don't you put together a proposal for what you have in mind?" Marcus spent the next few days researching local veteran support organizations and thinking about what kind of program might be most effective. He discovered that there was a significant need for job training and mentorship programs, areas where his company's expertise could make a real difference. He also learned about the challenges that many veterans faced in accessing benefits and services. The bureaucracy was complex, and many veterans, especially those dealing with mental health issues or traumatic brain injuries, struggled to navigate the system effectively. There was a clear need for advocates and guides who could help veterans access the resources they were entitled to. As Marcus developed his ideas, he found himself thinking about the broader issues facing veterans in his community. Housing was a major concern, with many veterans priced out of decent accommodations by rising rents. Employment was another challenge, with some employers hesitant to hire veterans due to misconceptions about PTSD or physical disabilities. The more he researched, the more Marcus realized that individual charity, while important, wasn't enough to address systemic problems. There needed to be broader changes in policies and attitudes, better coordination between organizations, and more effective advocacy for veterans' needs. One evening, as he was working on his proposal at home, Marcus received a call from David. David's caseworker had helped him secure a spot in a transitional housing program, and he was starting a part-time job the following week. The progress was encouraging, but David also shared some disturbing news. "There's this guy at the shelter, name's Robert," David said. "He's been trying to get help for months, but he keeps getting turned away from places. He's got some physical disabilities from his service, and some of the staff act like he's faking it or exaggerating. It's really getting to him." Marcus felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. He had been fortunate to avoid most of the negative stereotypes and discrimination that some veterans faced, but he knew they existed. The idea that a fellow veteran was being turned away from services because of ignorance or prejudice was infuriating. What kind of help does he need? Marcus asked. He's trying to get into a job training program, but they keep saying there are no openings or that he doesn't meet the requirements. But I've seen the paperwork, and he's qualified. I think they just don't want to deal with his disabilities. Marcus made a note to look into Robert's situation. If there was discrimination happening, it needed to be addressed. He had learned during his own recovery that veterans had legal protections against disability discrimination, but enforcing those protections often required knowledge and persistence that not everyone possessed. As he finished his call with David, Marcus reflected on how much his perspective had changed since starting his new job. Success in his own life had given him the confidence and stability to look outward and think about how he could help others. But it had also made him more aware of the inequities and challenges that many veterans continue to face. The comfortable routine of his workdays was grounding, but the stories he was hearing from other veterans were a constant reminder that not everyone had been as fortunate as he had been. The question was what to do with that knowledge and the privilege of his position. The morning that would change, everything started like any other. Marcus had submitted his volunteer proposal to Tech Solutions and was waiting for approval to start a mentorship program for transitioning veterans. He felt good about the progress he was making, both professionally and in his community involvement. The work at Tech Solutions continued to challenge him in positive ways, and his supervisor had hinted at a possible promotion in the coming months. Marcus called his usual rideshare to get to work, but the app indicated an unusually long wait time due to high demand. When a car finally arrived 15 minutes late, Marcus was already running behind schedule. The driver was a man he hadn't met before, someone named Rick according to the app, who looked to be in his 50s with graying hair and a stern expression. As Marcus approached the car, Rick rolled down his window and looked him over, taking in the sight of Marcus's cane and the way he walked. Instead of getting out to help or even greeting him pleasantly, Rick remained seated and watched Marcus navigate getting into the back seat with obvious impatience. "You the pickup for downtown?" Rick asked brusquely, not bothering with any of the usual pleasantries that Marcus had come to expect from rideshare drivers. "Yes, Tech Solutions building on 5th Street, Marcus replied, settling into his seat and placing his cane beside him. He noticed Rick's eyes in the rearview mirror, studying him with what seemed like disapproval. The first few minutes of the ride passed in uncomfortable silence. Marcus tried to make conversation, mentioning that it was a beautiful morning despite the traffic, but Rick only grunted in response. When they hit a particularly heavy backup near the highway entrance, Rick's mood seemed to darken further. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Rick muttered, apparently to himself, but loud enough for Marcus to hear clearly. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, not understanding the comment. Rick met his eyes in the rearview mirror, and Marcus could see irritation and something else, perhaps disgust, in the older man's expression. "Nothing against you personally," Rick said, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but I'm getting real tired of this city bending over backwards for every sob story that comes along." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, but he tried to give Rick the benefit of the doubt. "I'm not sure what you mean. Look around," Rick said, gesturing vaguely at the traffic. "Half the problems in this city come from people who think the world owes them something. Everyone's got a disability, everyone's got trauma, everyone needs special treatment. And the rest of us are supposed to just deal with it." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had encountered ignorance and insensitivity before, but rarely so direct and personal. "I think there might be some misunderstanding," he said carefully, trying to keep his voice level. Rick laughed harshly. "No misunderstanding. I see guys like you all the time. Something happens, and suddenly you can't work a regular job like everyone else. My grandfather fought in World War II, and you didn't hear him complaining about every little thing. He came home and got back to work." Marcus felt his temper rising, but years of dealing with difficult situations had taught him to stay calm when confronted with ignorance. "Actually, I do work a regular job," he said. "I'm a cybersecurity specialist." "Yeah, right," Rick scoffed. some desk job they gave you because they felt sorry for you. Meanwhile, real workers are losing opportunities to people who check the right boxes. The conversation was spiraling into territory that Marcus knew was dangerous for his blood pressure and his peace of mind. He considered asking Rick to stop the car so he could get out and call another ride, but they were in the middle of heavy highway traffic with no safe place to pull over. Earn my position based on my qualifications and experience, Marcus said firmly. My military service gave me valuable technical skills that my employer needs. Rick's response was even worse than Marcus had expected. Military service, he said mockingly. Half you guys went over there looking for trouble and then came back expecting a medal for getting hurt. My taxes are paying for your benefits while you take jobs away from people who actually deserve them. The injustice of the accusation was staggering. Marcus felt his hands clenching into fists, and he had to consciously force himself to breathe deeply. He had served his country with honor, had nearly died for it, and had worked incredibly hard to rebuild his life and contribute to society. To have his sacrifice and dedication dismissed so callously was almost more than he could bear. I think you have a very mistaken impression, Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled anger, about veterans and military service. We volunteered to serve our country, and many of us paid a significant price for that service. Spare me the patriotic speech, Rick replied. I know plenty of veterans, real ones, who don't go around expecting handouts and special treatment. They came home and got on with their lives without making everyone else accommodate their problems. Marcus realized that trying to educate or reason with Rick was hopeless. Some people's prejudices were too deeply rooted to be changed by a single conversation, especially one happening in the confines of a car during morning rush hour. He decided to end the conversation and simply endure the rest of the ride in silence. But Rick wasn't finished. As they approached the downtown area, he continued his rant, apparently emboldened by Marcus's silence. The problem with this whole generation is that everyone thinks they're special. Everyone thinks they deserve something just for showing up. Back in my day, you worked hard and you didn't expect anyone to make excuses for you. Could you please just focus on driving? Marcus finally said, his patience exhausted. Rick's response was to slow down significantly, well below the speed limit, making what should have been a simple drive take even longer. I'll drive, however. I want to drive, he said. This is my car, and if you don't like it, you can get out. The threat was clear, and Marcus realized he was dealing with someone who was not just ignorant, but potentially dangerous. Rick's behavior had crossed from offensive comments into deliberate harassment and intimidation. Marcus began to worry about what might happen when they reached his destination. As they pulled into the downtown area, Rick's driving became more erratic. He took several unnecessary turns, apparently trying to extend the ride and continue his harassment. When Marcus pointed out that they had passed the correct turn for his office building, Rick claimed he knew a better route. Listen, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. I just need to get to work. Could you please take me to the address I gave you? I heard you the first time, Rick snapped. But I don't take orders from passengers, especially ones who think they're better than everyone else. Marcus was now genuinely concerned for his safety. Rick's behavior had escalated from rude comments to deliberate harassment and what seemed like kidnapping. He considered calling 911, but worried that it might provoke Rick into doing something even more dangerous. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Rick pulled up in front of the Tech Solutions building. But instead of simply ending the ride, he turned around in his seat to face Marcus directly. Let me give you some advice, Rick said, his voice low and menacing. The world doesn't owe you anything just because you got hurt. Maybe if you spent less time feeling sorry for yourself and more time acting like a real man, people would respect you more. Marcus was shaking with anger as he got out of the car, but he managed to do so without responding to Rick's final insult. As soon as he was safely on the sidewalk, Rick drove away, leaving Marcus standing outside his office building feeling humiliated, angry, and shaken. The encounter had lasted less than an hour, but it felt like much longer. Marcus stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, trying to compose himself before going into the office. His coworkers knew him as calm and professional, and he didn't want to bring the ugliness of Rick's harassment into his workplace. But as he stood there, Marcus found himself thinking about all the other veterans who might be subjected to similar treatment. David, Robert, and countless others who were already struggling with difficult transitions and mental health challenges. How would they handle an encounter like this? What if they didn't have the emotional stability or support systems that had helped Marcus get through it? The realization that Rick's attitudes were probably not unique was deeply disturbing. If one rideshare driver felt comfortable expressing such vicious prejudice toward a veteran, how many others harbored similar feelings? How many veterans were being discriminated against in employment, housing, health care, and other essential services by people who shared Rick's twisted worldview? Marcus finally made his way into the office building, but he was still trembling with anger and adrenaline. The security guard, a friendly man named Carlos who always greeted Marcus with a smile, noticed that something was wrong. "You okay this morning, Marcus?" Carlos asked with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus paused, considering whether to share what had happened. Carlos was a veteran himself, having served in the Air Force in the 1990s. Maybe he would understand the particular sting of having his service dismissed and mocked by someone who had never worn a uniform. "Rough ride to work," Marcus said finally. Some people have very strong opinions about veterans that they're not shy about sharing. Carlos's expression darkened. "What happened?" Marcus gave him a brief summary of the encounter with Rick, watching Carlos's face grow increasingly angry as the story unfolded. When Marcus finished, Carlos shook his head in disgust. "I'm sorry you went through that, brother," Carlos said. "Some people just don't get it. They think military service is like a hobby or something, not a life-changing commitment." As Marcus rode the elevator up to his floor, he found himself thinking about what action, if any, he should take. He could report Rick to the rideshare company, but what good would that do? Rick would probably get a warning at most, and he would continue driving other veterans who might not have the emotional resources to handle his abuse. The more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized that Rick's behavior represented a larger problem that needed to be addressed systematically. Individual complaints might help in specific cases, but they wouldn't change the underlying attitudes that made such harassment possible in the first place. By the time Marcus reached his desk, he had made a decision. The volunteer program he was developing for Tech Solutions needed to include an advocacy component. Veterans needed allies who would stand up for them when they encountered discrimination and harassment. They needed people who understood their rights and were willing to fight for them. The encounter with Rick had been painful and humiliating, but it had also clarified something important for Marcus. His comfortable new life came with responsibilities to other veterans who were less fortunate. The question was no longer whether he should get involved in advocacy work, but how quickly and effectively he could make it happen. Marcus spent the morning trying to focus on work, but Rick's words kept echoing in his mind. Every few minutes, anger would flare up again as he remembered the driver's mocking tone and deliberate cruelty. By lunchtime, he had made up his mind to file a formal complaint with the rideshare company, not because he expected dramatic results, but because Rick's behavior needed to be documented in case other veterans reported similar incidents. After uploading screenshots of a ride and writing a detailed account of what had happened, Marcus decided to call his friend David to see how he was settling into his new housing situation. David had been making steady progress, but Marcus wanted to make sure he was aware that harassment could come from unexpected sources. "You won't believe what happened to me this morning," Marcus said when David answered the phone. He recounted the encounter with Rick, watching David's expression grow darker as the story continued. "That's awful, man," David said when Marcus finished. "But honestly, I'm not surprised. I've dealt with stuff like that more times than I can count. When you're homeless, people feel even more free to share their opinions about veterans who are mooching off the system." David went on to describe several incidents where store clerks, security guards, and random strangers had made similar comments about veterans looking for handouts or exaggerating their problems. The consistency of these experiences suggested that Rick's attitudes were indeed more widespread than Marcus had hoped. The worst part, David continued, is how it gets in your head. After a while, you start to wonder if maybe they're right. Maybe you're just making excuses. Maybe you should be handling things better. Marcus understood that feeling. Even with his successful career transition, Rick's words had shaken his confidence and made him question whether his accomplishments were legitimate. For someone already struggling with self-doubt and trauma, such encounters could be devastating. They talked for a few more minutes about ways to handle these situations, and David mentioned that he had started carrying a small card with information about veterans' rights and legal protections. A caseworker gave it to me, he explained. Sometimes people back down when they realize you know your rights and aren't just going to take their abuse quietly. After ending the call with David, Marcus returned to his work, but found himself researching discrimination law during his breaks. He discovered that veterans were protected under several federal and state laws, but enforcement was often difficult, especially in situations like ride-sharing where the interaction was brief and private. That evening, Marcus decided to take the bus home instead of calling another rideshare. The bus route took longer and required a short walk from the stop to his apartment, but he needed time to process the morning's events and think about what to do next. As he sat on the bus, watching the city pass by through the windows, Marcus found himself studying the other passengers. There was an elderly man with a walker, a young woman with a service dog, and several people who might have been veterans based on their bearing and the way they carried themselves. He wondered how many of them had faced discrimination or harassment because of disabilities or life circumstances beyond their control. The bus stopped at a major intersection, and Marcus noticed a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk near what appeared to be a government building. As the bus waited for the light to change, he could see signs and banners indicating some kind of protest or demonstration. One banner read, "Support our veterans," and Marcus realized it was probably related to the VA budget cuts that had been in the news recently. On impulse, Marcus pulled the cord to signal his stop. He got off the bus and walked toward the demonstration, curious to see what was happening and whether he might be able to contribute in some way. The crowd turned out to be about 50 people, a mix of veterans and civilians, gathered outside a regional VA office. They were protesting proposed cuts to mental health services and demanding better funding for veteran programs. Several speakers were taking turns addressing the crowd through a small portable amplifier. Marcus listened as a Vietnam veteran named Frank described his struggles to get treatment for PTSD and how budget cuts had forced him to wait months between appointments with his counselor. A younger woman who identified herself as an Iraq War veteran talked about friends who had committed suicide while waiting for mental health care. "The system is failing us," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the small crowd. "We served our country with honor, and now our country is abandoning us when we need help the most." The words resonated with Marcus, reminding him of his morning encounter with Rick. The rideshare driver's attitude was just one symptom of a larger problem. Society's failure to adequately support veterans created an environment where people felt free to dismiss and mock their struggles. As the demonstration continued, Marcus noticed a news van pulling up across the street. A reporter and camera operator got out and began filming the crowd. The Vietnam veteran, Frank, approached the reporter and began explaining the issues that had brought them together. Marcus watched the interview with interest, but he also found himself looking around at the other people in the crowd. Many of them appeared to be struggling financially based on their clothing and general appearance. He recognized the particular weariness that came from fighting bureaucracy while dealing with health problems or disabilities. Near the edge of the crowd, Marcus spotted a familiar figure. It was Robert, the veteran that David had mentioned who was having trouble accessing job training programs. Marcus made his way over and introduced himself. "David Chen told me about your situation," Marcus said. "I'm Marcus. I work in tech, and I might be able to help you navigate some of the barriers you're facing." Robert looked surprised, but grateful. He was a man in his early 30s who walked with a pronounced limp and spoke with a slight stutter that Marcus recognized as a possible symptom of traumatic brain injury. Despite his obvious disabilities, Robert carried himself with military bearing and spoke intelligently about his efforts to find work. "The job training program keeps telling me I don't qualify," Robert explained, "but when I ask for specifics, they give me different answers every time. I think they just don't want to deal with my limitations." Marcus asked Robert to walk him through the application process step by step. As Robert described his experiences, it became clear that he was facing discrimination disguised as bureaucratic procedure. The training program administrators were creating arbitrary barriers rather than making reasonable accommodations as required by law. "This is exactly the kind of thing that needs to be documented and challenged," Marcus told Robert. "Have you considered filing a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission?" Robert shook his head. "I don't know how to do that, and I can't afford a lawyer." Marcus realized that this was a perfect example of how veterans' lack of resources made it difficult for them to enforce their rights. Even when laws existed to protect them, the complexity of the legal system created additional barriers for people who were already struggling with disabilities or trauma. As the demonstration began to wind down, Marcus exchanged contact information with Robert and several other veterans he had met. He found himself thinking about how his corporate volunteer program could be expanded to include legal advocacy and support for veterans facing discrimination. The bus ride home gave Marcus more time to think about the day's experiences. The contrast between his successful job at Tech Solutions and the struggles of other veterans was becoming increasingly clear to him. His employer had been exemplary in their treatment of him, but many other companies and organizations were not living up to their legal and moral obligations to veterans. When Marcus reached his apartment, he called Jennifer Walsh, his supervisor, at home. He apologized for the late call, but explained that he had some urgent ideas about expanding the volunteer program they had discussed. "I was at a veteran demonstration tonight," Marcus explained, "and I realized that the mentorship program we talked about needs to include advocacy training and legal support. A lot of veterans are facing discrimination, but they don't know their rights or how to fight back." Jennifer listened carefully as Marcus described his encounters with Rick and Robert and his growing understanding of the systemic nature of the problems facing veterans. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment before responding. "This sounds like something we should definitely discuss with our legal department," she said. "Tech Solutions has always been committed to supporting veterans, but if there are widespread discrimination issues, we might be able to do more than just individual mentoring." They agreed to meet the next day to discuss how the company might be able to contribute to advocacy efforts. Jennifer mentioned that Tech Solutions had connections with several law firms that did pro bono work, and that the company's legal team might be interested in supporting veterans' rights cases. After hanging up with Jennifer, Marcus spent some time researching veterans' rights organizations online. He discovered that while several national groups existed, there was a significant gap in local advocacy and legal support. Many veterans were facing discrimination and isolation, without knowing that others were having similar experiences or that legal remedies might be available. Marcus began drafting an email to the veterans he had met that day, proposing that they start meeting regularly to share experiences and develop strategies for addressing discrimination. He included information about legal protections and resources for filing complaints when those protections were violated. As he wrote, Marcus thought about how much his perspective had changed since his encounter with Rick that morning. What had started as a personal humiliation had evolved into an understanding of his responsibility to help other veterans who were facing similar or worse treatment. The work would be challenging, and progress would likely be slow. But Marcus had learned in the military that difficult missions required patience, planning, and teamwork. The veterans he had met today were struggling with problems that could be solved, but only if someone was willing to organize the effort and see it through. Before going to bed, Marcus sent a text to David, updating him on the demonstration and his conversation with Robert. David responded immediately, saying that he was interested in being part of any advocacy group that Marcus might organize. "It's about time someone started fighting back," David wrote. "I'm tired of being treated like a second-class citizen because I had the guts to serve my country." Marcus smiled as he read the message. The anger and frustration that Rick had generated that morning was being transformed into something positive and productive. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since his injury, Marcus felt like he had found his true mission. The meeting with Jennifer Walsh the next morning exceeded Marcus's highest expectations. Not only was Tech Solutions willing to support an expanded veteran advocacy program, but Jennifer revealed that the company's CEO, retired General Patricia Morrison, had been looking for ways to address the very issues that Marcus had raised. General Morrison served in the Army for 30 years before joining Tech Solutions, Jennifer explained as they walked toward the executive conference room. She's been concerned about reports of veteran discrimination in the private sector, and your proposal comes at exactly the right time. Marcus felt his nervousness increase as they approached the CEO's office. He had never met a general before, and despite his own military service, he wasn't sure what to expect from someone who had reached such a high rank. General Morrison turned out to be a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and an authoritative but warm presence. She greeted Marcus with a firm handshake and immediately put him at ease with her direct, no-nonsense communication style. "Jennifer tells me you've been experiencing some challenges with discrimination," General Morrison said, gesturing for Marcus to take a seat at the conference table. "I'd like to hear about it directly from you, if you're comfortable sharing." Marcus recounted his encounter with Rick and his subsequent research into the experiences of other veterans. General Morrison listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as the story continued. When Marcus finished, she leaned back in her chair and shook her head. "What you experienced is completely unacceptable," she said firmly. "But, unfortunately, it's not uncommon. During my transition to civilian leadership, I heard similar stories from dozens of veterans. The problem is that most incidents go unreported because veterans don't know their rights or don't have the resources to fight back." General Morrison went on to explain that she had been discussing this issue with other veteran-friendly CEOs and had been looking for a way to address it systematically. Marcus's proposal for a legal advocacy component to their volunteer program aligned perfectly with her vision. "What I'm thinking," General Morrison said, "is much bigger than a single company volunteer program. I want Tech Solutions to lead a coalition of businesses that are committed to protecting veterans' rights and holding discriminatory organizations accountable." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Marcus had expected when he woke up that morning. General Morrison outlined a plan that would involve partnering with law firms, veteran service organizations, and other companies to create a comprehensive support network for veterans facing discrimination. "The key," General Morrison explained, "is to make discrimination against veterans expensive and public. Right now, companies and individuals who engage in this behavior face no consequences. We need to change that calculus." Marcus found himself thinking about Rick and wondering how the rideshare driver would react if he knew that his passenger was connected to people with the resources and determination to hold him accountable for his actions. Jennifer Walsh had been taking notes throughout the meeting, and she now presented Marcus with an offer that took his breath away. Tech Solutions wanted to create a new position for him as Director of Veteran Advocacy, with a substantial salary increase and the resources to build a program that could serve as a model for other companies. "You'd be working directly with our legal team and external partners to identify discrimination cases, provide support for affected veterans, and develop policy recommendations for businesses and government agencies," Jennifer explained. Marcus was overwhelmed by the opportunity, but he also felt the weight of responsibility that would come with such a position. The veterans he had met at the demonstration and in his volunteer work would be counting on him to deliver real results, not just good intentions. "I'm honored by the offer," Marcus said carefully, "but I want to make sure I understand what we're committing to. This isn't just about helping individual veterans file complaints. We're talking about challenging systemic discrimination and changing how society treats veterans." General Morrison nodded approvingly. "Exactly right. And that's why I need someone who understands the issues from personal experience and has the technical skills to help us build effective systems for tracking and addressing discrimination. The meeting concluded with Marcus accepting the new position, effective immediately. General Morrison assigned him an assistant and gave him access to the company's legal resources to begin building the advocacy program. She also arranged for him to meet with the CEOs of several other veteran-friendly companies within the week. As Marcus left the executive conference room, he felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The opportunity to make a real difference in veterans' lives was exactly what he had been hoping for, but the scope of the challenge was daunting. His first call was to David Chun, who was so excited by the news that he offered to help with the program in any way he could. David had been documenting his own experiences with discrimination and had started connecting with other homeless veterans who had similar stories. "This is incredible, Marcus," David said. "For the first time since I got back from Iraq, I feel like someone is actually going to fight for us instead of just offering thoughts and prayers." Marcus's second call was to Robert, who was equally enthusiastic about the potential for systemic change. Robert had been documenting his experience with the job training program and had discovered that several other disabled veterans had been rejected by the same program under suspicious circumstances. "If we can prove a pattern of discrimination," Robert said, "we might be able to force them to change their policies and compensate all the veterans they've illegally turned away." Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into building the advocacy program. Working with Tech Solutions' legal team, he developed a system for documenting discrimination cases and connecting affected veterans with appropriate legal resources. The company's connections with pro bono law firms proved invaluable in providing representation for veterans who couldn't afford attorneys. The first major case they tackled was Robert's situation with the job training program. Tech Solutions lawyers reviewed the documentation that Robert had collected and confirmed that there was clear evidence of disability discrimination. They filed a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and threatened a federal lawsuit if the program didn't change its policies immediately. The training program's response was swift and decisive. Within 2 weeks, they had admitted their mistakes, changed their admission policies, and offered Robert a spot in their next training class along with a public apology. They also agreed to review the applications of all veterans who had been previously rejected to ensure they hadn't discriminated against others. Word of the successful intervention spread quickly through the local veteran community. Marcus found himself fielding calls from veterans across the region who had experienced discrimination in employment, housing, healthcare, and other services. Each case was different, but the pattern of ignorance and prejudice was remarkably consistent. One case that particularly struck Marcus involved a veteran named Sarah who had been denied an apartment rental because the landlord assumed that her PTSD diagnosis made her dangerous. Another involved a veteran named James who had been fired from his job after disclosing his traumatic brain injury to his supervisor, despite his excellent performance record. Working with General Morrison and the growing coalition of veteran-friendly businesses, Marcus began developing a comprehensive strategy for addressing discrimination at multiple levels. They created an online reporting system that allowed veterans to document incidents anonymously, building a database of evidence that could be used to identify patterns and target enforcement efforts. They also developed training programs for businesses that wanted to improve their treatment of veterans but weren't sure how to do so effectively. The training covered legal requirements, best practices for accommodation, and strategies for creating veteran-friendly workplace cultures. The advocacy program's success attracted attention from national veterans organizations and government agencies. Marcus found himself testifying before congressional committees and speaking at conferences about the discrimination issues facing veterans and the need for stronger enforcement of existing laws. 6 months after his encounter with Rick, Marcus received an unexpected call from the rideshare company. They informed him that Rick had been permanently banned from their platform after multiple complaints about discriminatory behavior toward passengers with disabilities. The company had also implemented new training requirements for all drivers and created a system for quickly addressing discrimination complaints. Marcus felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that Rick could no longer abuse other veterans through the rideshare platform. But he also recognized that this was just one small victory in a much larger struggle. The attitudes that had motivated Rick's behavior were still widespread, and changing them would require sustained effort over many years. The real measure of success came through the stories of individual veterans whose lives were improved by the advocacy program. David Chun had completed his job training and found stable employment with a company that actively recruited veterans. Robert had not only completed his training program, but had been hired by Tech Solutions itself as a cybersecurity analyst. Sarah had won a settlement from the landlord who had discriminated against her and had used the money to make a down payment on her own home. James had been rehired by his former employer after the company faced a federal investigation and was now helping them develop better policies for supporting employees with disabilities. Each success story reinforced Marcus's conviction that the work was making a real difference. But he also remained aware that thousands of other veterans were still facing discrimination and harassment without any support system to help them fight back. As he sat in his new office at Tech Solutions, looking at the wall covered with thank you letters from veterans who had been helped by the advocacy program, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since that difficult morning with Rick. What had started as a personal humiliation had evolved into a mission that gave deeper meaning to his own recovery and success. The prosthetic leg that had once made him self-conscious now served as a visible reminder of his commitment to serving veterans who were facing challenges. His injury had become not a limitation, but a source of credibility and motivation in his advocacy work. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed Pete, the rideshare driver who had been so supportive during his job search. Pete had become a volunteer with the advocacy program, using his position as a driver to identify veterans who might need help and connecting them with resources. "How's it going out there today, Pete?" Marcus asked when Pete answered. "Pretty good," Pete replied. "I picked up a veteran this morning who's been having trouble with his disability benefits. I gave him your card and told him about the program. He seemed really grateful to know that help was available." As Marcus hung up the phone, he thought about the network of allies that had grown around the advocacy program. Pete was just one of hundreds of civilians who had become advocates for veterans' rights after learning about the discrimination issues they faced. The work was far from over, but Marcus felt confident that they had built something sustainable that would continue to grow and evolve. The next generation of veterans returning from overseas would face challenges, but they would also have a support system that previous generations had lacked. General Morrison had been right that changing the calculus around veteran discrimination required making it expensive and public. But more than that, it required building a community of people who refused to tolerate prejudice and were willing to act when they encountered it. Marcus gathered his papers and prepared to leave for another meeting with veteran advocates from across the state. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, he could rest knowing that his service to his fellow veterans was just beginning and that the impact would extend far beyond anything he could have imagined when he first put on his uniform all those years ago.